How's it going, guys? In today's lesson, we're going to be going over how we can create this anime quotes generator, and it's going to be using a live API. So we're going to be learning how to make a very clean network request, and we're also going to be using MVVM for this. So I definitely recommend you follow along if you want to understand how these concepts work in more detail. But as the app itself is going to be very simple, we're going to be making a request from an API, which is going to download some anime quotes, and it's going to put them in a list, which we can manipulate, of course. And we're also going to have a function that allows us to refresh the list so that we can get new quotes as soon as we refresh. And we're also going to go over test mode and regular mode, so we don't have to waste our API data when we are testing. And this app is going to look good in dark mode as well as light mode. So a lot of good stuff here, and we can get started immediately by creating a new empty project in Xcode. And the very first thing I want to talk about is the API. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be using this anime API, and I'm going to be leaving it in the description box down below. So go ahead and click on that and click on get started. And we're just going to get 10 random quotes. So to do this, all we have to do is use this endpoint over here. And we're going to copy that and paste it in the bar above. Then it's going to return to us 10 different anime quotes. And what we're going to do here is go and find the raw version, and preferably we're going to format that and copy it. The reason being is that we're going to be using this as the default data in our app. So we're going to actually go ahead and create a new file, and it's going to be under empty. And you want to go down and click on empty other. And here we're going to call it quotes.json. Now inside this file, just go ahead and copy and paste that entire file, because again, we want to have a solid form of the data that we can use to preview in our application and also for testing. So before we actually try to make the actual data request, we're going to set up the entire app using the dummy data. And then I'll show you, of course, how we can create a very clean API request. So before we do anything, we need to go ahead and create a model of this data. We need to let the user know, or we need to let ourselves know, that we have an anime field, a character field, and a quote field. And they're all of type string, so just remember that. So inside our folder, go ahead and hold Command+N and create a new Swift file. And we're just going to call this model for now. And it's going to be a struct of quotes, which is going to conform to decodable and identifiable. And first we want to create an ID, and it's going to equal a UUID. And then we want to go ahead and retrieve the other fields. So here we're going to go ahead and type in let anime be of type string, let character be of type string, and let the quote be of type string. And note that these names match as the ones in the quotes JSON. And let's drag this actually above the quotes. I actually might rename this to model with a capital M, but these fields should be exactly the same as the ones in the JSON. And the ID is not in the JSON. So if we actually run the program as it is, it's going to crash because it's not going to be able to find this key over here. And that's why we need to go ahead and add some coding keys. So here we're going to type in private enum coding keys. And that's going to conform to the string protocol and the coding key protocol. And what the string protocol does here is make sure that every case that we create, such as case anime, is going to give it a raw value of the string. So for this example, we're going to type in case, character, anime, and quotes. So these are the coding keys. We're telling the program that this is not a coding key and that this shouldn't even be searched in the JSON, but we can still use it in the program, of course. But these are the ones that it wants to search for. So anime is going to be anime, character is going to be character, and quote is going to be quote. But if you had some other field in your program and you actually wanted to name this something else, you can go ahead and type in let name of type string be that, and then you need to go ahead and create a new case, which is going to be name is going to equal anime. So the code is going to look for this field over here in the JSON and assign it to name. And that's practically just a shortcut you can use with coding keys. But there's no point in doing that at the moment, so we're just going to use what the program gave us, which is anime, character, and quote, and exclude the ID. And the reason we're also doing this is because if we did not have these coding keys, for example, and we typed in let id equal UUID, we're going to get this yellow error, which is going to tell us immutable property will not be decoded because it is declared with an initial value which cannot be overwritten. And the fix is going to turn it into a variable. But if you guys try to run this as a variable, your program's going to crash because the ID cannot be found in the JSON. And that's why we have this coding keys section. Now, the next thing to do is to go ahead and actually retrieve the JSON data. So let's go ahead and create a file called extensions. So Swift file, extensions. And since this has to do with the bundle, we're going to go ahead and create an extension on the bundle. So inside here, the first thing we want to do is create a function called decode. And we're going to make it generic. So we're going to add a T of type decodable. And we're going to add a file of type string. And the reason we're making it generic is because we want to be able to decode any kind of file in our program just by passing it in. And the function we're about to create is something that you can copy and paste in as many apps as you want. It's going to be extremely reusable. So I'm just explaining it once more here so you can have an idea on how it works. But the very first thing we want to do is create a URL, which is going to equal the self.url for resource of the file with the extension of nil. And if that doesn't work, we're going to throw an error, a fatal error, which could not find file in the bundle. So if this doesn't work, it just means that whatever file we passed in just cannot be found. If we try to pass in quotes.json and it's not there, it's going to throw an error. Then we need to go ahead and create another guard let data equal try, and this might throw, so we're going to have to return nil if it does, and that's why we add the question mark. And we're going to try to get the data for the contents of the URL. Else, we're going to throw another fatal error that we could not load the data or the file from the bundle. And finally, we want to create a decoder that can take the JSON data and decode it. And that's just going to equal a JSON decoder. So here we're going to type in let loaded data equal try question mark, so it might return nil. And we're going to call the decoder.decode t.self from the data, if it's there, of course. Else, we're going to create another fatal error, and it's going to say could not decode the file from the bundle. But if we make it through all of those guards, we can just go ahead and return the loaded data. So as you can see, we have lots of fatal errors here, which is going to terminate our program immediately. And this is okay because this has to be there. If we throw anything inside here that throws a fatal error, it means our program just was not meant to run because we're missing the quotes JSON, or we haven't formatted it correctly, or something's wrong with the program itself. It's not something that the user is going to run into. It's only something that's going to throw an error when we create this app. But with this being done, we can actually go ahead and use it. And the first place I want to use it is in the model, because inside here, I want to create some sample data. And here we can go ahead and type in static var, because this is going to be accessible throughout the entire application. And it's going to be sample quotes, which is going to be of type quote in an array. And it's very important you note that it's inside an array. And the way you can tell that is by going to quotes.json. And as you can see, we have many quotes. So we're also going to have these angle brackets at the top that tell us that we have a list of items. And in that case, it means we also need to surround this by the angle brackets so that we can access it correctly. Otherwise, if you do not have these angle brackets in your quotes.json, you just need to decode the quote itself. So make sure you decode the right kind of data. And with that, we can go ahead and call the bundle.main.decode, and the file is going to be the quotes.json. And we will create another static var, which is going to be a sample quotes, and that's going to equal sample quotes.first. And it's never going to be empty, so we can safely unwrap that with an exclamation mark. Now, if you're curious about actually seeing this data being loaded, we can go to our content view, and inside here we can go ahead and type in onAppear. And onAppear, we're just going to go ahead and print, and we're going to call the model, actually call that quote, and we can just call sample quotes. So it's going to print this array as soon as we run this application. So let's go ahead and run the application and see what we get in the terminal. So once it loads, you'll notice we're going to get this heavy mess back, which is going to be all of the JSON that we've created inside the quotes.json. So everything's working perfectly, and if you don't have this, go back and check what you missed. But otherwise, now we're going to go ahead and create the UI to display this information, and then we're actually going to create the API manager itself, which is going to have the live API associated with it. So let's go ahead and close this, and we can take away the onAppear because we will not use that. So the very first view we're going to create is going to be the item view. So here we're going to go ahead and create a SwiftUI view, and we're going to call it item view and create. And let's load that. Perfect. Now it's going to be a very simple view, and the only requirement it's going to have is that we have a quote. So that's going to equal a quote or be of type quote. And in the preview, go ahead and type in quote, which will be a quote of sample quote. So as you can see, that was incredibly easy to create a preview. We have all the data we need to create a nice preview so we can style it however we like. So inside here, we'll go ahead and type in vstack with the alignment set to .leading and the spacing set to 6. We're then going to have an hstack, which is going to have a text view, and the text view will be the quotes.anime. And we want the font to be .headline. Then we'll add a spacer, so it pushes it all the way to the left. Then I'll have a divider, and under the divider, we'll go ahead and add a text view, which will have the quotes.quotes. And inside that, we can go ahead and give it font with a style of .body. We can go ahead and also copy the first hstack, place it right under the quote, and here we're going to type in quote.character. So we can see who wrote this, and we actually want to interpolate this. So we'll do that, and we'll add a small dash in front of it. And this should be set to footnote, and the spacer is going to be on the other side. And then we're going to add some padding to the vstack. So that's going to be our basic item row. Now we can go ahead and open the sidebar and go to content view so we can see how that's going to look in our application. So inside here, we're going to close the sidebar, and we're also going to go ahead and get started by creating some quotes. So we're going to say let quotes equal quotes.sampleQuotes. So we can use those freely inside this application. And here we're going to create a navigation view. And inside the navigation view, we'll have a list. And what we want to do is first make sure we have a navigation title, which will be called anime quotes. And we want to make sure that this is refreshable. And here we're going to just add the refresh request. And we're going to add that later when we create the API. But for now, let's go ahead and add a for each loop. And it's going to take the quotes. So for each quote in here, we can go ahead and create an item view, which is going to hold the quote, which will be the quote, of course, and we'll give it a padding of 4. So as you can see now, we have all of the quotes loaded inside our application, and these are not live quotes, so we can't really get any more. It's going to load, but nothing's going to happen. But that's already a good start for displaying some preview data into our application. But the next thing we really want to do is create a ViewModel and an API manager. So first of all, we're going to go ahead and create the API manager. So go ahead and create a new Swift file, and we're going to call it API manager. And we can close the sidebar. And the very first thing we're going to do is create a final class called API manager, since we do not want this to be inherited by anyone else. And it's going to hold a private enum of API error, which is just going to be an error type in case we run into this error. And it's going to hold case invalid URL. But of course, you're welcome to add more errors inside here if you want to handle them directly. But under there, we're going to go ahead and create a function called getData, which is going to be generic and it's going to be decodable. And you're going to notice a lot of this is going to look like the other decode function that we used for the JSON. The only difference is this is going to handle live data. So here we're going to add URL of type string, and we want to pass in a model of t.type so we can decode any type of data. And we're going to add a completion listener. And it's going to be at escaping, since it's going to outlive the function. And this is going to return to us a result, and the result is going to hold our data type, and it's going to hold an error. and it's going to return nothing. But with that being done, we can open the block, and that's actually a very long line of code, I know, but we just need to make sure we can insert any URL of our choice and that we can model it with any kind of data, and that we'll get the response as the response itself. And if there's an error, it's going to return an error. But the first thing we should do, as always, is guard let URL equal a URL from the string of URL. And if this doesn't work, we're going to go ahead and call the completion listener, and we're going to insert the failure because it did not work, and the error is going to be set to the API error.invalid URL. So that just tells the program, hey, you inserted a URL that doesn't work, so we're going to exit out. And then we can go ahead and create a URL session if that does work, because we now have a URL with good data that we want to decode. So we're going to create a data task, and it's going to be with the URL. Then we can take away the completion handler and create a closure, because inside here we're going to take the data, the response, and the error. So we can use all of that in the following code. Now first we're going to guard let data equal data, else we're going to handle it as follows. If let error equal error, we're going to return the completion listener with a dot failure, and we're going to insert that error. And then we also have to return. And I actually prefer this to be a one-liner, so we're going to do it like this. And that's going to take care of checking whether there's an error and returning it if there is. Now let's say we do have the data, then we're going to go ahead and say do, and we're going to try the following code. Let server data equal try JSON decoder, and we want to decode t.self from the data. And finally, the completion listener is going to return a success, which is going to be the server data. And this happens to go wrong. We're going to go ahead and catch that, and we're going to add the completion listener of dot failure once again with the error included. So we're always going to be able to understand what went wrong in our decoding when we have this failure listener. And the most important part, which I usually always forget, is to resume the URL session, or nothing's going to happen. So that takes care of creating an API request. As you probably noticed, we still have to create a URL, we still need to make sure the data is valid, and we still need to try to decode it. And it's nearly exactly the same as what we did earlier. If you might recall, in the extensions, we have to check for the URL, we have the data, and we need to try to decode it. So they're very, very similar, but they cannot be used interchangeably, because this one, of course, has less requirements. It can be used with static JSON, such as this one over here, that's inside the bundle, and the API manager one is used with live data. So the final step we need to cover is creating the view model and actually using this. So go ahead and click on your folder and create a new file, which we're going to call ViewModel. And the view model, I'm going to place it right under the content view, and the item view will be under the content view as well. And we're going to click on that view model and create a final class called ViewModel, which will conform to the observable object protocol, because we're going to have one published variable, which is going to be the quotes, and that's going to equal an empty array of quotes. Then we want to go ahead and private let base URL equal the anime URL. So here we're going to go ahead and grab the link from earlier and just paste it inside here so we can use it. And we're going to create an instance of our API manager. So API manager is going to equal the API manager. And we will have an initializer, which is going to take a test mode of type Boolean. And the test mode is going to be used to save us from wasting precious API data. So if the test mode is set to true, then we want to go ahead and return a fake API request. So here we're going to type in make fake API request. Else we're going to go ahead and just make a regular API request. And we haven't created those functions yet, so let's go ahead and do that really quick. So function make API request and function make fake API request. So that's all the test mode is going to do. It's going to save us from using precious data by making a fake API request, which is just going to return dummy data. Otherwise, if we want to test it in production mode, go ahead and use the regular one. But first, to take care of making the fake API request, we're going to go ahead and say that self.quotes is going to equal the quotes quotes.sample quotes. So it's just going to assign it the fake quotes. Otherwise, to make the API request, it's going to take a bit more work. So we're going to go ahead and call API manager, get data for the base URL, and it's going to be modeled according to the array of quotes. So quotes.self, and the completion is going to be returned in a closure. So here we can go ahead and type in first weak self, and you might not be familiar with weak self, and it's very easily actually to exclude that if you're new to SwiftUI or Swift in general. But weak self is supposed to prevent us from having any memory leaks when we're making these API requests. And it's a bit more complex than that, so I'm not going to dive into detail about that in this lesson. But if you're curious, go ahead and make a quick search. We use this in places, especially when making API requests, because sometimes you're going to make lots of API requests, and very often that can lead to memory leaks. So for this example, we're just going to use weak self to follow the safe practices. And we're going to also guard let self, which is going to equal self else return. And we need to unwrap this because weak self is going to make everything that references self optional. So we want to make sure it's not optional because it's incredibly annoying to work with optionals. Then we can go ahead and create a dispatch queue.main.async, and we can do everything as we normally would. But first we need to create a switch for the result because we want to handle the cases, which is of course case.success, which is going to hold the quotes. So let quotes, and inside here we just refer to self.quotes and assign it the quotes. And there's also the case of failure, because where there is success, there is failure. So let's error, and inside here we can go ahead and type in let error quote equal a quote. And here we're just going to create a sample quote with the anime character and quote. So the anime will be error, the character will be error, and the quote will be the error.localized description. And the self.quotes is going to equal this error quote and nothing else. And we can also print the error for debugging. And the reason I decided to create this part here is because sometimes you're going to run into issues such as you've reached an API limit, and sometimes that's really hard to debug. You don't understand why your API is not working. But in this case, I created this because I learned that the anime API has a limit of 100 requests per hour. So I accidentally ran into that. And when I ran into that, I was looking for why my JSON didn't work. And it happened to be because I was well over the hourly limit. So better to display an error to the user rather than display nothing at all. And that's what I did over here. But that's actually all we need to do with this API request. Now we can go back to our content view and actually use the view model. So here we're going to go ahead and create a state object, private var VM, which is going to equal a view model. And it's going to ask us to specify a test mode, which is going to be set to true initially. And we're going to remove this quotes variable down here because we're actually going to refer to the vm.quotes now. And the refreshable is going to be set to vm.makeAPIRequest. And everything's going to be the same. It's still going to load the same view model data or the same quotes from the JSON, especially if we have test mode to true. It's going to understand that we have some data to load. If you set it to false, I believe that this data can actually disappear because now it's testing with the live data. So of course, when you're previewing and doing things, it's nice to have that to true because it's going to find it in the bundle immediately and it's going to load the test data everywhere, including when you run the app. So let's go ahead and run the app. So as you can see, it loads immediately the test data. And if we set this to false, it's going to actually try to make a real API request. So now we actually have real data here. As you can see, it says Naruto and Keke-san and Naruto again. And you can read 10 quotes. And if you decide to refresh this at any point, you're going to get some new options such as Black Lagoon, Raruni, and you can refresh it again. But just keep in mind that you have a rate of 100 API requests per hour. And once you run into that, it's going to throw an error. And you can also simulate the error if you want. You can go to your view model and destroy the URL. You can say there's a space between AP and I. And now when you run the program, we're going to get an error in our code and it's going to tell you the error immediately over here. So it's really good to read what's here and check in your logs to see what's going on. And here it doesn't really say anything useful. until the bottom where it says invalid URL. So it's very important we pay attention to every detail in our code. So let's close that and rerun the program one more time. And perfect, we have 10 more quotes. So as you can see, we created a full quotes application using MVVM, and we also created a very clean network request using a ViewModel and an API manager. We also created a very important extension that you're going to use throughout your entire career. And yeah, that just about covers everything I wanted to discuss in today's lesson. So as always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.